The air outside the courthouse was thick with tension. Supporters in red berets held their breath waiting for the verdict that could decide the future of one of Africa's most defiant voices. Julius Malema, the fiery leader of South Africa's economic freedom fighters, had just been declared guilty in a controversial firearm case. For the state, it was a matter of law. For the people, it was something much darker, the continuation of a long tradition of silencing black leaders who dare to demand justice. The images are painfully familiar. Nelson Mandela locked away for 27 years, Steve Biko tortured and killed in his cell, Muammar Gaddafi bombed and hunted like an animal, and now Julius Malema facing the possibility of 15 years in prison, not because of a gun, but because of his voice, his demand that land stolen generations ago must be returned to the people who own it by birthright. As Malema stood before the crowd, he did not bow his head. He lifted it high and declared, "Prison or death is a badge of honor." Those words shook the streets. They were not just about one man's trial, but about a continent's struggle for dignity. And in the same breath, he reached across borders, standing shoulder to shoulder with Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, the young soldier president who defies Western powers and insists that Africa will rise on its own terms. So the question is not only about South Africa, it is about the entire continent. If Malema is silenced today, who will be silenced tomorrow? If Traoré is targeted tomorrow, who will defend him? My friends, stay with me to the end of this story. Because what is happening in Johannesburg is connected to what is happening in Ouagadougou. And what is happening in Africa today may well shape the world tomorrow. Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. The courtroom in Johannesburg was not just a chamber of justice, it was a stage where the weight of South Africa's unfinished history came crashing down. Julius Malema, the 43-year-old leader of the economic freedom fighters, sat in the dock as the magistrate read the verdict guilty in what has been called the firearm discharge case. The charge dated back years to an incident in 2018 when Malema allegedly fired a rifle during a political rally. At first glance, it seemed like a simple case of law and order, but the deeper you looked, the more the cracks appeared. Malema had been accused of illegally handling a firearm, yet the very man prosecutors claimed handed him that weapon, accused number 2, was acquitted. If the alleged supplier was innocent, how could the recipient be guilty? The contradiction hung in the air like smoke. Even Malema's supporters shook their heads in disbelief. For them, it was not about a gun. It was about silencing a man who had become too dangerous for the powerful. The stakes were enormous. Under South African law, any public official sentenced to more than 12 months in prison loses his seat in parliament. For Malema, the punishment could be far worse. The magistrate warned that the conviction carried a maximum of 15 years. A 15-year sentence would not just strip him of his position, it would bury his political career and remove him from the front line of South Africa's struggle over land wealth and justice. And that is exactly why the verdict carried such explosive weight. Malema was no ordinary politician. He had built the EFF into a national force by rallying millions of poor working-class black South Africans who still lived in the shadow of apartheid. His demand was as simple as it was radical expropriation of land without compensation. To the dispossessed, it was a call for dignity. To the white minority, who still owned 75% of the land, it was a threat to their survival. To the international financial system, it was heresy. That courtroom verdict ignited something larger than the walls could contain. Outside, EFF supporters sang liberation songs echoing the freedom chants of the 1970s. Red berets waved like flames. Young fighters, many of them barely born when Mandela walked free, declared they would never accept the ruling. To them, this was not a legal decision. It was a political assassination carried out through the courts. Malema himself leaned into that interpretation. Standing tall after the judgment, he declared, "They have been waiting for me for 7 years. They were not looking for the truth, they were looking for me. But let them know prison or death is a badge of honor for a revolutionary." His words rippled through the crowd. Men and women wept, not out of fear, but out of recognition. They had seen this play before: Mandela behind bars, Biko in chains, liberation leaders across the continent, silenced through trials, assassinations, or exile. The ruling also revealed another layer of strategy. Malema vowed to fight on, promising to appeal first to the Supreme Court and then to the Constitutional Court. This is not about a firearm, he insisted. This is about racism dressed up as justice. This is about appeasing the white supremacists of South Africa and the Oval Office of Donald Trump. To many, the mention of Washington was no accident. Leaked reports had already circulated that U.S. officials questioned Malema's growing influence, worried that his firebrand style could destabilize Africa's most industrialized economy. So what began as a minor charge years ago had now grown into a decisive battle over South Africa's future. Would the voice calling for land reform be silenced by prison bars? Would the party he built from scratch brick by brick in dusty townships be decapitated just as it was preparing to challenge for greater power? The events of that day were not only about Julius Malema the man, they were about Julius Malema the symbol. A symbol of a South Africa still struggling to reconcile its promises of equality with the realities of economic apartheid. A symbol of a continent where those who dare to speak too loudly against empire often pay the highest price. The moment the verdict was announced, Julius Malema did not flinch. The cameras caught his eyes steady, unbroken, burning with defiance. Outside, the chants of thousands of EFF supporters grew louder, echoing through the streets of Johannesburg. The people were not chanting about a firearm, they were chanting about freedom, land, and dignity. Malema seized that moment, turning a court defeat into a battlefield victory. Standing before his supporters, he raised his voice above the roar. Prison or death is a badge of honor. We cannot be scared of prison. We cannot be scared to die for the revolution. Those words did not sound like the words of a man defeated. They sounded like the rallying cry of a soldier preparing for the next war. It was here that the case transformed from a local legal matter into a continental struggle. Malema accused the magistrate of presiding over a racist judgment crafted to please South Africa's white elite and, beyond them, the corridors of Washington. He reminded the crowd of the words of Donald Trump, who once pressed President Cyril Ramaphosa to explain why Malema was not already in jail. "Do you see?" he asked. "This is not about the law, it is about appeasing the Oval Office." The crowd erupted. They had seen this script before. Nelson Mandela branded a terrorist locked away for decades. Steve Biko tortured and murdered in his cell. Thomas Sankara cut down in his prime. Muammar Gaddafi hunted like an animal under the banner of NATO protecting civilians. And now Julius Malema, guilty not of firing a gun, but of firing up a generation. The high point came when Malema linked his struggle to others beyond South Africa. He named Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, the young leader who has defied Western encirclement and declared that Africa must no longer be told what to do. If they kill Traoré, they wound the whole of Africa, Malema warned. If they jail me, they jail the struggle of black people everywhere. The symbolism was electrifying. Two leaders, one in uniform and one in a red beret, standing as different faces of the same resistance. For Malema's followers, the message was clear. This was not just about one man's fate. It was about the fate of their children, their communities, their unfinished revolution. Old women waved photographs of Mandela and cried, saying they had not lived through apartheid just to watch history repeat itself. Young men pounded their fists and shouted that they would never abandon the 7 cardinal pillars of the EFF, especially the call for land expropriation without compensation. The reaction spread far beyond the courthouse. Across the continent, activists and intellectuals took to social media declaring solidarity with Malema. In Burkina Faso, pro-Traoré voices spoke of a shared battle against neo-colonial structures. In Zimbabwe, echoes of Robert Mugabe's land reform fights resurfaced. In Ghana, memories of Kwame Nkrumah's overthrow were invoked. The narrative was crystallizing. Malema's trial was not an isolated case, but part of a long war against leaders who dared to challenge global systems of control. Internationally, the press coverage split sharply. Western outlets framed Malema as reckless, a populist playing with fire. African and diaspora platforms, on the other hand, described him as a torchbearer of a new resistance. The polarity only deepened the symbolism. To the empire, he was a danger. To the oppressed, he was hope. And in the middle of it all stood Malema himself, neither begging for mercy nor retreating into silence. He promised to appeal, to fight the verdict to the very top of the judicial system, and if necessary, to serve his time with his head held high. "They are not trying me for a gun," he thundered. "They are trying me for my voice. They are trying me for demanding land. But this land was not stolen with a court order, and it will not be returned through silence." That was the climax. Not the judge's gavel, but the roar of a leader turning persecution into prophecy. The trial had begun as a test of one man. It ended as a test of a nation and perhaps of Africa itself. The gavel may have struck in one courtroom, but its echoes rippled far beyond those walls. For South Africa, the guilty verdict against Julius Malema was more than a legal judgment. It was a political earthquake with aftershocks that touched every corner of the nation. Within the economic freedom fighters, the consequences were immediate. The possibility of their leader facing a 15-year sentence left the movement at a crossroads. Could the EFF survive without the fiery voice that had carried it from the streets of townships to the chambers of parliament branch? Leaders whispered of contingency plans, yet the rank and file were adamant. There is no EFF without Malema. The red beret had become more than a party symbol. It was a badge of belonging, a promise of unfinished liberation. Removing Malema would feel to many like cutting the heart out of the body. The broader political landscape was equally unsettled. For decades after the end of apartheid, the African National Congress (ANC) had dominated South Africa's politics. But corruption scandals, unemployment, and growing inequality had eroded trust. Malema's EFF offered an alternative, radical, unapologetic, demanding land redistribution and economic justice. The trial, instead of weakening that vision, risked turning Malema into a martyr. Across townships and universities, young South Africans asked if they can silence Malema, who speaks for us. The land question lay at the center of it all. Nearly 30 years after democracy, 75% of South Africa's land was still owned by the white minority. For the black majority, many of whom still lived in shacks without basic services, the promise of freedom felt hollow. Malema's trial sharpened that wound. If the man who dared to demand land without compensation was jailed, it would not only be his defeat, it would be the defeat of millions who saw him as their mouthpiece. Civil society responded with mixed emotions. Some urban elites argued that Malema had crossed the line, that his rhetoric endangered stability. Yet in rural areas and working-class neighborhoods, the opposite was true. People saw the trial as proof that the system was rigged to protect privilege. Grandmothers who remembered apartheid whispered that it felt as if nothing had changed, black leaders punished, white wealth untouched. Politically, the judgment threatened to destabilize more than just the EFF. Rival parties weighed their options. Some feared that martyring Malema would radicalize the youth and ignite unrest. Others quietly welcomed the prospect of his removal, hoping to divide his movement and absorb disillusioned supporters. The ANC itself faced a dilemma: distance itself from the ruling and risk angering white business interests, or stand behind it and alienate millions of poor voters. Either choice deepened the cracks in a nation already struggling to hold together. Beyond party politics, the case struck at the core of South Africa's constitutional democracy. The promise of equality under the law was once its proudest achievement, but to many the Malema verdict exposed a double standard, harsh for those who challenge white monopoly capital, lenient for those who profit from it. As one activist put it outside the courthouse, this is not justice. This is a message, and the message is clear: don't dare disturb the peace of the powerful. For the ordinary South African, the implications were deeply personal. Was democracy still theirs, or had it been captured by the same interests that profited under apartheid? Could they trust the courts, or were the courts just another weapon in the arsenal of the wealthy? Each question hung heavy in the air. In the end, the political consequences of Malema's trial extended far beyond his own future. They raised a haunting possibility that South Africa was at risk of betraying its own liberation, of turning the dream of 1994 into a mirage. And for many, that was the deepest wound of all. To understand the trial of Julius Malema, one cannot stop at Johannesburg. The ripples stretch across oceans all the way to Washington, London, and Paris. For this was never only a South African matter, it was a global chess game, with Malema cast as one of the most dangerous pieces on the board. For the United States, Malema represented a threat not because of what he had done, but because of what he might inspire. Washington's strategists understood that a radical land reform movement in South Africa, the continent's most industrialized economy, could set a precedent for the entire region. If black South Africans reclaimed land without compensation, why wouldn't Zimbabwe revisit its own reforms? Why wouldn't Namibians, Zambians, or even Nigerians rise to demand the same to America? Malema was a spark too close to a field of dry grass. That is why his name surfaced even in the Oval Office. During a meeting between Donald Trump and President Cyril Ramaphosa, Trump reportedly pressed, "Why is Malema not jailed?" The question revealed the unease at the heart of American policy. Malema was not merely a South African populist. He was a symbol of resistance against what many Africans call white monopoly capital, and by extension against Western dominance. Europe, too, watched with wary eyes. London and Brussels feared the destabilization of South Africa's investment climate. Paris, with its long history of controlling African economies through the CFA franc and military presence, quietly welcomed any move that weakened leaders like Malema, who openly aligned himself with the Pan-Africanist wave sweeping the Sahel. For Western powers, the danger was not one man in a red beret. The danger was contagion, the spread of defiance. By contrast, in parts of Africa and the global south, Malema's trial was seen through a completely different lens. In Burkina Faso, commentators linked his struggle to that of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Both men were young, outspoken, and unafraid to call the United States and Europe by name. Both rejected the idea that Africa should remain a supplier of raw materials and a consumer of Western loans. And both faced efforts through media sanctions or courts to cut them down before their visions could take root. In Ghana, activists recalled how Kwame Nkrumah had been overthrown with covert Western backing. In Libya, the ghost of Muammar Gaddafi loomed large, another African leader removed under the banner of protecting civilians. And in Zimbabwe, echoes of Robert Mugabe's controversial land reform resurfaced, casting Malema as his spiritual successor. Even beyond Africa, in the diaspora, Malema's plight struck a chord. Black activists in the United States drew parallels to their own history. Martin Luther King Jr. surveilled by the FBI, Malcolm X assassinated after denouncing global imperialism, and leaders of the Black Panthers crushed under COINTELPRO. To them, Malema was not an outlier, but part of a long pattern Black leaders punished whenever they rose too high or spoke too boldly. The global divide was stark. To Western elites, Julius Malema was reckless, dangerous, even destabilizing. To millions of Africans and their allies, he was courageous, necessary, and perhaps the only one speaking truth in an age of compromise. And standing beside him in spirit was Ibrahim Traoré, the Burkina captain, who has become a rallying point for Africa's younger generation. Together, they represent something larger than politics. They embody the possibility of a new chapter where Africa no longer asks permission to be free. For Washington and its allies, that possibility is precisely what makes them so dangerous. For Africa, it is what makes them so necessary. History has a way of repeating itself, and Africa has paid the price each time. From Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana to Patrice Lumumba in Congo, from Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, whenever a leader rose to demand dignity for Black people, the machinery of empire found a way to silence them. Today, Julius Malema stands at the edge of that same storm. His trial is not only about whether he fired a gun, it is about whether South Africa and Africa at large will be allowed to shape its destiny without interference. If Malema is jailed, it will not end with him. It will be a message to every revolutionary voice: step out of line and you, too, will be broken. And if Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso is targeted tomorrow, it will be the same story told again, different names, same script. But here is the warning: every time a leader has been silenced, another has risen. Mandela from Robben Island, Sankara from the ashes of colonial Burkina Faso, Traoré from the barracks of Ouagadougou. You cannot kill the idea of freedom. You can only delay it. For America, for Europe, for the so-called guardians of democracy, this is the uncomfortable truth. Their attempts to control Africa may backfire. Each trial, each sanction, each interference only deepens the anger, the memory, and the unity of a people who have had enough. For ordinary Americans watching this, especially those of you who lived through the civil rights era, the parallels are unmistakable. You know what it means when justice is bent to serve power. You know how dangerous it is when courts are used to silence the voices of the oppressed. So I leave you with these questions. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective yet, or are they just the beginning of a larger storm? Can we continue to trust leaders like Malema and Traoré to carry the weight of an entire continent's hope, or will history force us to find new champions once again? This is not the end of a story. It is the opening of a new chapter. And whether you live in Johannesburg, Ouagadougou, or New York City, what happens next will shape the world you leave behind for your children and grandchildren. Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines, and don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below. Because your voice, yes, yours, is part of this struggle too.